Tonight, Shili Nishma Ravi Marido Ber Mervin Ruven Halevi Mimorati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And this Shabbos we have the privilege of reading Parshat Re'eh, which has quite a number of different topics within it. Amongst them are the Chagim, laws of Kashrut, lots of laws about a whole variety of things, but we're going to focus tonight on one I will call overarching law, general law that we've seen before earlier in Sefer Dvarim. And we're going to focus on some of the applications of this and some of the comments on this interesting halacha. So we're going to go first. I want to put it in context. We're going to start with this week's parsha. It's Perek Yud Gimel, if you want to follow along. Just to give you a little context of this, we're going to see a number of halachot that all seem to deal with some aspect of idolatry and the precautions we should be taking to remove ourselves, to distance ourselves from idolatry. So in Perek Yud Gimel, we're told the following: when Hashem will cut off the nations that you're inheriting, and you will inherit and live in their land, Torah tells us, Moshe Rabbeinu tells us the following: be very careful that you don't search after them after you've destroyed them. And you shouldn't inquire into their gods to say, wait, if their gods were good enough for them, how could they serve them? Then we should serve them also. So that's the first thing we're told. Then we are told at the end of this same section that deals with idolatry, we're told the following: all of these words that I am commanding you, those you should be careful to do. Lo tosef olav, do not add to it. Velo tigra mimenu, and don't take away from it. And then we have it followed by three different sections that again deal with different aspects of idolatry. A false prophet who comes and tells you, let's go serve idols. A member of your family who comes or a close friend who tells you, and come, let's go worship idols. And finally, the case of a city where inhabitants of the city convince the entire city to go and worship idols. So we have this mitzvah of not adding and not subtracting in the middle of a whole section that deals with idolatry. Now, this is very reminiscent of something we read just 2 weeks ago in Parshat V'etchanan in chapter 4. We read the following: listen to the laws that I am giving you today in order that you should live and come and inherit the land that Hashem is giving you. And again, very similar phraseology. Lo tosif ala davar asher anochi mitzavetchem. Don't add to the word that I am commanding you. Velo tigru menu, and don't detract from it. Lishmor et mitzvot Hashem Elokeichem asher anochi mitzavetchem, to follow all the mitzvot that I am commanding you. And there again, it tells us you saw all that happened in Baal Peor, because Baal Peor, all the people who worshipped Baal Peor, Hashem destroyed. So again, there's a connection of the same concept of not adding, not subtracting. Again, seems to be connected in some way to idolatry. So we're going to look at and compare and contrast these two psukim that talk about this concept of not adding and not subtracting to the mitzvot. So again, I want to just bring them up, and you'll notice there's a lot of similarities in the phraseology here. So here in our parsha, which is on your right, we have et kol davar asher anochi mitzavet chamotot tishmu laso lo tosev olav lo tigra mimenu. Now the difference between our parsha and the parsha of V'etchanan is very clear. When you look at the blue, you see it says lo tosef. Here in the parsha of V'etchanan, it's lo tosifu in the plural. Here it's in ours is phrased in the singular. There it's phrased in the plural. Same thing with the lo tigra and lo tigru mimenu. And what is it we're not supposed to add to? The davar asher anochi mitzavetchem, a davar asher anochi mitzavetchem. Notice in the parsha of V'etchanan, it's repeated twice. The davar asher anochi mitzavetchem in our parsha, it only appears once. So we're going to look at what Rashi says in these two places. Firstly, he says, following et kol hadavar. Why does it say ours there in et Hanan? It just says hadavar. It doesn't say kol hadavar. So our Rashi says ours adds kol hadavar to teach us kala kachamura, that light mitzvot are equal to heavy mitzvot. Whatever light mitzvot, whatever heavy mitzvot are, both are equivalent in terms of that we have to observe them, but not add to them or subtract for them. And again, tishmeru la'asod is a very strange language. To tishmeru, you should guard to do. And Rashi says that tishmeru always is a mitzvah lo taseh. Litain lo taseh alaseh amur parsha. That adding and subtracting is there is a negative command, or to observe the mitzvot, there is a positive command and a negative command. That every mitzvah is a double mitzvah, really, is what Rashi is trying to tell us. So when you have a negative command, you transgress it. When you transgress it, not only are you transgressing a negative command, but you are doing something inappropriate. So you're transgressing both a positive command to guard against watching it, and on the same thing with a positive command, you're supposed to guard to do the positive command. So in each case, it's a negative command as well as a positive command. Shkoli shomer, and Rashi explains why, because tishmeru is a lashon of lo taseh. It's a negative command, but lasot is a positive command. However, even though there is a negative command that we transgress when we don't appropriately fulfill a mitzvah, nonetheless, there's no direct punishment meted out by the court in terms of lashes that we might get if it's a negative command. There are certain negative commands that carry a penalty, others do not. Now, Rashi, on our concept of lo tosef alav, tells us what is it that we are not supposed to be adding. It says, chamesh totafot b'tfilin. To add means that we have tefillin, and we know that in tefillin there are 4 parashiot. If I decide, well, I want to add a 5th parasha to my tefillin, that is called, then I have transgressed this mitzvah of lo tosef alav. Or chamesh minim belulav. I decide, I want to have a lulav and an etrog and the hadasim and a ravot. I want to add another one. I'm going to add, a piece of wheat to my lulav to make it 5 different plants that I want in my lulav. Similarly, Rashi here says, Arba brachot b'virkat kohanim. If the Kohanim suddenly decide, we don't want to stop, we're not going to stop at Shalom, we're going to go and add another bracha because we want to bless this congregation so much, we're going to add another bracha to the regular 3 that we give them. And Rashi very simply says, by the way, the opposite, if it's a chen lo tigru, similarly they shouldn't remove. What does that mean? And by the way, over there he adds chamesh tzitzit, having 5 tzitzit, having a 5-cornered garment that has tzitzit on it, whereas we know that tzitzit are a 4-cornered garment. So any of these things is considered adding. And similarly, if you only said, I'm only going to put 2 parashot in my tefillin instead of 4, or I'm only going to put lulav and an etrog, and I'm going to forget the dasim and ravos because I don't really care about them. Any of those things is considered adding and subtracting. So what Rashi is saying that this mitzvah of lo tosef and lo tigra, adding and subtracting, is not creating a new mitzvah or saying, well, I'm not going to keep this mitzvah because it's not really that important. What it is it's taking a mitzvah and changing the aspect of the mitzvah. In other words, changing the actual mitzvah itself, saying, it's not enough or it's too much. I'm going to change the number involved with this mitzvah. Sfarno. Now, Sfarno is interesting. He says is giving a rationale here. So I'm going to again start with Sfarno on the right hand side. Lo tosef olav. We shouldn't add to a mitzvah. Why? Ki ulai tosif davar nimas etzlo yisparach. That what is going to happen, you will add something that is inappropriate, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu deems inappropriate for the performance of this mitzvah. As it will be, just like we want to come up with a new way to serve Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash. Because at times this will be an inappropriate way to serve Hashem. For example, he gives the example that was given, by the way, in the Torah itself. that, oh, I love Hashem so much, I'm going to take my children and offer them as a korban to Hashem. Not what Hashem wants us to do. That's not an appropriate way to serve Hashem. Okay, so that's what Sforno wants us to say. Lo tigra mimenu. Okay, now what does it mean I shouldn't detract, say, take away from it? So again, Sforno gives a very interesting psychological underpinning. Afilu besur sibat hamitzvah be'einecha. Even if there is a reason and a rationale given in the Torah for this mitzvah, and you say, that doesn't apply to me, so I don't need to keep this mitzvah. And he gives a very powerful example from history, Kinyan Shlomo, like Shlomo Melech, we know that there are 3 special mitzvot that apply to the king. He's not supposed to have too many horses, too many wives, and too much money. And Shlomo says, I know the reason for those, so since there's a reason, and the reason doesn't apply to me, I don't have to keep this mitzvah. What Sforno was saying, no, this mitzvah of Lo Tigra Menu says, even if you think that the reason for the mitzvah doesn't apply to you, you still have to keep the mitzvah. By the way, basically he says the same thing back in here. Again, he says basically very similar language. I'm not going to bother reading it, but it's the same thing over there too in Bet Hanan. Okay, here we go. Okay, Bechor Shor. Now, some of these commentaries are from Bet Hanan, some are from this week's parsha. But again, they're basically all commenting on the same thing. What does it mean to add, and what does it mean to subtract from the mitzvot? So Bechor Shor tells us the following: Lo tosifu. What he means is that lo tosifu, not to add, really means kim lo tosifu lo tigru. If you won't add, you won't subtract. Aval im tosifu, but if you will add, if you will say, oh, okay, I'll add a mitzvah, by adding a mitzvah, tigru, you're already detracting from the performance of the mitzvah. That everyone who adds something is really taking something away. For example, he gives, if you'll make 5 strings in your tzitzit, we know that tzitzit are 4 strings folded over to make 8. So if you put 5, you no longer have 4. You've now got 5. So you've uprooted the whole mitzvah of 5 by adding. You thought you were adding and making it better. You're not, because now you've taken away the original 4. What you've done is now taken away the mitzvah itself. There's no longer a mitzvah. Why? Because you didn't do it in the appropriate fashion. By adding an extra thread, you have said, I don't care what Hashem said, I only need 4. I want to have 5. That's not Hashem's mitzvah. To put 5 threads in your tzitzit is not Hashem's mitzvah. The mitzvah is to put 4. So since you insisted, I want to put 5, you have not done what Hashem asked. And similarly, by adding a parshat to tefillin, your tefillin, they're now your tefillin. They're no longer Hashem's tefillin that Hashem commanded you to wear. And the same thing with adding an extra different type of growth to the lulav, something else to the lulav. Now, Horshar goes a step further than we've gone so far. Aval, im yashavta chet yamim besukkah lo. If you decide on the day after Sukkot, you're on Shmini Atzeret, you want to sit in the sukkah, he says that doesn't count as lo tosifu. Why? Because lo garata zayin, right? In other words, by going in the 8th day and sitting in your sukkah, you haven't negated the fact that you sat in the sukkah for 7 days. It's a whole different day. It's not connected to the previous days, so you're okay. You haven't done a mitzvah, but you haven't detracted from the fact that you sat in the sukkah for 7 days. But nonetheless, in the other cases where you're adding it to tefillin, you've changed the basic tefillin. Here, you're not changing the basic mitzvah of sukkah. You just say, I liked it so much sitting outside. It was such a nice day. I'll go sit outside again. No problem. Umihu, however, lefi apshat nireh garua. According to the simple explanation, it seems that when it takes that you should not detract or reduce, shenira shlo asita hashiva l'shem mitzvah. It appears when you sit in the sukkah on the 8th day, you are saying that, I just like to sit outside because it's beautiful weather. I'm not sitting in the sukkah because there's a mitzvah. So you're taking the 7 days that you sat in the sukkah and you're saying, I really wasn't doing that for a mitzvah. Shabbalah mitzvah okay, because even if there's no mitzvah to sit outside, you sit outside in your sukkah. Umihu, and unless, however, Chorshor ends with the following: Umihu Kadosh Baruch Hu Yodea Libot Bnei Adam V'Chavanatam. Hashem understands what your intent was in sitting in the sukkah. So if you really intended to sit in the sukkah all 7 days and to do it the mitzvah, Hashem certainly knows that that was your intent. And you sat outside on the next day simply because it was a nice day. That's fine, as long as when you were sitting in the sukkah the other days, you weren't just saying, oh, it's a nice day, let's go sit outside. You were doing it for the mitzvah. Hashem knows which is which, he says. Okay. Niskuni. Lo tosifar al hadavar. Okay. Again, don't add anything. Sha'al yedei shosaftim al divari. By adding to my words, Hashem is saying, Shahis harti, that I have given you, Re'ei natana Hashem lefanecha ha'aretz. We see what happened historically. You decided that what Hashem said wasn't enough. Why? Because Hashem told you, look, I'm giving you Eretz Yisrael, Alei Reish, go up and inherit it. And Vosaftim, and you, Bnei Yisrael, decided what were you going to do? Amartem nishlachana shim lefanenu. Let's first send these spies. Well, we don't know what Hashem we're getting into. Let's send some spies. So by doing that, because even though Hashem had already given them marching orders, go into Eretz Yisrael and inherit Eretz Yisrael, they said, no, we're not ready yet. This, you Am Yisrael, adding this idea that, let's send spies and see what's going on, which was not what Hashem wanted, caused the whole generation to die in the Midbar. That's what lo tosifu, because tosifu, when you add something to what Hashem is telling you, you're going to get into trouble. Lo tigru mimenu, and you also tried to detract from what Hashem said. Ani amarti al talu. After the spies came back and Hashem said, no, you can't go into Israel, some people said, let's go. And Moshe told them, no. Vatem karatem mitzotai, and you ignored what I said, don't go up. And what happened? So again, the Am Yisrael was faced with defeat because the people decided, we changed our mind, we do want to go up. And after Hashem had said, no, it's too late. So now Moshe is telling Am Yisrael, understand that when Hashem gives you the mitzvot, they are as they are. Don't try adding, don't try taking away. Do what Hashem tells you to do. Okay? Davar acher, another interpretation of this whole concept. Lo tosifu al davar, don't add anything. This is tshuva l'minei Yisrael shepakru al hatamul Talmud v'amru. This is an answer to those who wanted to abrogate the Torah and didn't like the fact that there was now what we call a Talmud, a Torah Shebal Peh. The Amru, and they asked, how did the sages, how could the sages add things in the oral law or in the Talmud that are not part of the Torah? It says you shouldn't add anything. So all these additions that the Talmudists added, we should get rid of. The answer to their question is as follows. This language of not adding and not subtracting, these are the only two places in the Torah we found them. The Eino Rak Gabe Elahot V'Yirah. And he wants it that one way of looking at it is if we looked at the context of both of these sections, it's in the context of Avodah Zarah. It's in the context of idolatry. Kolomar, as if to say, Ein lecha losif liyira al yirat HaKadosh Baruch Hu yira acheret v'lo ligroa miyirato. This whole mitzvah of adding and subtracting is to say that you're not supposed to add any other God or any other thing that you are in awe of besides Hashem. And also you should not lessen the awe that you have of Hashem. So the whole concept here is related to our fear of Hashem or our awe of Hashem, our relationship with Hashem, to the exclusion of all idols. And that's why it's lo tosef. You shouldn't add any idols that you want to worship, because there are people who say, I'll worship God, but I also want to worship these idols too. They're also good. And the answer is no. Hashem says only Hashem, nobody else. That's what this lo tosef and lo tigra, and that's why it's only here and in the two places that we mentioned, both in the context of avodah zarah. As we saw, both of these are in sections that deal with idolatry. In our parshat it says lo tosef olav lo tigra mimenu uktiv el v'samoch higamet bneihem yet benotehem yusufu bo eish lelohehem. Again, it's the chapter immediately before it talks about idolatry. The chapter immediately after it talks about idolatry. But when it comes to, quote, the rest of the mitzvot, Lo hizir HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem does not warn us that we shouldn't add precautions in order to make a fence, a partition around the Torah to protect the Torah. So, for example, we have certain mitzvot that the Chachamim gave us to protect us from transgressing a Torah command, or to enhance a Torah command, to make sure that we are meticulous in carrying out the Torah command. So that's why we have all sorts of what we call rabbinic enactments to ensure that we will not transgress a Torah command. Some very interesting ones. I'll give you one simple example. We know that when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. Why don't we blow the shofar? Because we are afraid that somebody will come to transgress the Shabbos by blowing the shofar. So it's better we should sit and not perform this mitzvah than somebody should transgress the mitzvah of Shabbat. That's an extreme case where the Chachamim seemingly, quote, added and subtracted something, but they did it specifically to protect us from transgressing the Shabbat. Again, that concept is what Chizkuni is talking about here, that we have to be careful that we don't transgress Shabbat. And that's why there are many different things. Why do we light candles 20 minutes before sunset instead of waiting till the minute before sunset? Because Shabbos doesn't start before sunset. Why do we light candles 20 minutes earlier? Because if it's a cloudy day and they didn't have digital, precision watches, they might not get the exact time. So it was better to start a little bit earlier rather than somebody waiting till the last minute and then being a minute late and actually transgressing the Shabbat. So those are things that the Chachamim has said to make a protection around the Torah so that we should never come to transgress a Torah command. Okay, Ramban. Ramban, as usual, as he does many times, quotes Rashi, says that what is lo tosifu, putting 5 parshat in your tefillin, 5 things in the lulav, 5 tzitzit, and similarly lo tigru. That's Rashi's plan. That's exactly what Rashi's quoting from Sifrei. Again, the Sifrei says these psukim teach us this mitzvah that we have 4 parshat tefillin, specifically 4 minim in the lulav, specifically 4 threads that we double over in each tzitzit in each corner. And similarly, again, the same thing. A Kohen went up and he was saying the blessing of the Kohanim. Lo Yomar, he cannot imagine to himself, oh, since I already started giving Am Yisrael all these blessings that Hashem told me to give, I'll add more psukim that are psukim in the Torah that are blessings to Am Yisrael. Talmud Lomar Hadavar, even when it comes to words, afilu diber lo tosef olav, even when it comes to something that's only words. Birchat Kohanim is only the Kohanim saying words of bracha. Even then, we shouldn't add to what Hashem says. Hashem says the Kohanim give us 3 brachot, 3 psukim bracha. That's it. But these are not the only cases, Ramban says. Ela af hayashin b'sukkah b'shmini b'chavana loket. Even somebody who sleeps in his sukkah on this 8th day of Sukkot with the intent of fulfilling the mitzvah of Sukkah has also transgressed this command of not adding. Rosh Hashanah, as the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, if he only makes Sukkot 6 days, over Balavazeh, he's transgressed this mitzvah of lo tosif, not adding and not subtracting. Again, notice that Ramban added a very critical word here, b'chavana, that I intend to fulfill the mitzvah by being in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeret. I think I'm fulfilling a mitzvah. If I sit there because, it's a gorgeous night, let me sleep outside under the stars, that's not a problem. If I decide, oh, it's a beautiful morning, let's go eat out in the sukkah, fine, that's not a problem. But if I do it b'chavanah, thinking that I am now enhancing my fulfillment of the mitzvah of sukkah, then I've transgressed it, which is very similar to what Tzkuni said. The Kodesh Baruch Hu knows what we're thinking when we do this. But again, very important concept here. Ulefi dati, according to my thinking, Ramban says, afilu bada lasot mitzvah b'fnei atzma. Even there are other ways one can transgress this mitzvah. He made up a new mitzvah. Kigon, for example, he decided, you know what? I like Sukkot so much, I'm going to not do Sukkot once a year for 7 days. I'm going to do Sukkot 3 times a year. Each time I'll go build a sukkah in different seasons of the year, and I'll have more Sukkot. I love it so much. Why not have more? But he's doing it as a mitzvah over belav. He is, again, transgressing this mitzvah of not adding to the mitzvah. Because the mitzvah is, we do 7 days in Tishrei, not in Cheshvan, not in Nisan, not in whatever month you feel like doing it. If you're doing it as just, oh, I like to sleep outside, fine. But if you're doing it thinking it's a mitzvah, that's a no-no, according to Ramban. Kach Amru, and that is why Linyan Mikra Megillah. This is the question. How could they add Mikra Megillah, a reading of the Megillah on Purim? So again, now he's going to quote the Gemara here. Me'u Shmona Nevi'im Amdu Lem Yisrael. Throughout the history of the Jewish people, there were 180 different Nevi'im whose words are recorded somewhere in the Tanakh. They did not add or detract anything from the mitzvot of the Torah, even one little letter, chutz mimikra Megillah, except for the reading of the Megillah. And then the Gemara there goes through a whole concept of how they derived that it was okay to create a chag called Purim. Because there was a big debate about how can we create a chag. And if we look in the Megillah itself, Esther and Mordechai send out that they want to create this new chag, and they had to establish a new chag, and they had to rationalize how were they doing this and not transgressing the mitzvah of not to add. Or Yerushalmi, Shmonim v'chamisha zekanim. There were 85 elders, and we have common nevi'im, many of them who were actually prophets. Hayu mitztarim ala davar. They were very concerned on the fact that they were seemingly adding something new to the Torah. They were adding a new mitzvah called Purim, reading the Megillah. Amru katuv ela mitzvot asher tzivu Hashem et Moshe. These are the mitzvah that Hashem commanded Moshe. Ela mitzvot shenistafim b'Moshe. All the mitzvot that we have were already given to us through the mouth of Moshe. Kach amar lanu Moshe. That's exactly what Moshe told. Ve'ein navi acher asid l'chadish davar lachem. Nobody's going to come along and introduce anything new. Mordechai and Esther wrote in l'chadish lanu davar. Mordechai and Esther want to create this new holiday. How can they do it? Lo zazu misham. They did not leave this discussion. In other words, this discussion was debated. There was a huge debate. Nosim v'notnim b'davar. They were arguing. They were discussing this back and forth, pro and con of adding, not adding, and what is the sources. Jehir HaKadosh Baruch Hu Einehem, until HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to them how it was possible for them to add a mitzvah and not transgress this concept of not adding. Harei shahaita mitzvah zu asur lachem, which means that really, if Hashem hadn't explained to them by opening their eyes to understand why it was permitted, they would have been forbidden to do this. Im kain, hi bichlal lo tosif alav. Adding a new chag is also part of not adding to the Torah. We have not learned that we can add through the Navi. Ela min hakatuv shamar ela mitzvot she'ein Navi rashay l'chadesh bo davar me'ata. This pasuk tells us ela mitzvot, tells us these are the mitzvot. We're not supposed to add new mitzvot. Okay, but in the case of Purim, they had a specific way that they understood that they could add a chag, but we'll notice that the chag of Purim has a very, very different way of being observed than the chagim of the Torah. That we are allowed to do malacha that we would not bring a special korban on Purim, because those are things that define a Torah holiday. And the Chachamim said, we want to establish a specific Chag that is a different type of Chag. We have the same thing with Hanukkah later on in history, to say thank you to Hashem for this miracle. That's why the key on Hanukkah and Purim is not so much, is yes, we have what we call a festival, but it's the purpose of to remember and publicize the nace that Hashem did, that he saved Am Yisrael. And that is why it was allowed, because we know we have an obligation to acknowledge Hashem when he saves Am Yisrael. And that's why they were able to establish these days, but there were things that they were not allowed to establish as observances on those days. And that's the whole discussion there in the Gemara. Now, by the way, Ramban now wants to address another thing that we've already addressed above. What about all of the different fence laws that protect us from transgressing the Torah? All sorts of takanot that the Chachamim made throughout history to ensure that we do not mistake something and transgress something. Zui mitzvah min Torah. That in itself is a commandment from the Torah to the sages. But the key here, we have to understand that when the Chachamim tell us not to do something, to refrain, to try to keep us from transgressing, we have to always be able to distinguish that it's a rabbinic command, not a Torah command. So when we light candles 20 minutes earlier, if you missed 20 minutes and it's now 10 minutes earlier, you can say, oh, I can't light candles. The answer is yes, you can. Just don't make a habit of it, doing it every week, because 1 week that 10 minutes will become 5, and then it'll become 5, will become 0. And before you know it, you will be lighting candles on Shabbat itself. That's why they push the time back. But in a one-time deal where you're running a minute or 2 or 5 late, it's okay to do that because it's a rabbinic custom that wanted to try to distance us from transgressing the Shabbat. The Eina mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Torah, and these are certainly not Torah level commandments. This becomes very, very important when you are in an emergency situation. Being able to know what is a rabbinic command, what is a Torah command, because obviously we can be more lenient with rabbinic commands than we can with Torah commands in certain situations. And that's why it's very important. And we're going to see later on, I hope I'll get to it, why it's very important to distinguish between what is the actual Torah command and what is the rabbinic fence to try to keep you a step further away from transgressing that Torah command. Okay, Rav Shamshon Rafal Hirsch. Lo tosifu. We should not add. Kol ha-mitzvah, kol mitzvah, every commandment, shenitna lanu me'et Hashem, that Hashem has given us, titkayem al yodeinu b'shleimuta. We are supposed to observe it as it is commanded totally. Al nenaheg ba b'shirirut leib subjectivit. I love that word there in Hebrew, subjectivit. Al yedeshin nosif aleh onigra mimenu. We are not to say, oh, I don't feel like this little aspect, this nuance I don't care for, or I want to add another nuance here. Subjectively, we are not supposed to add or subtract and say, I'll do whatever I feel like in terms of this mitzvah. We have an obligation to fulfill the mitzvah as it was given. Like we've already seen, not more or less than 4 chapters in the tefillin, the 4 different things that we take in the lulav, the 4 strings that we use in the tzitzit, not more or less than the 3 psukim that the birchat kohanim. By the way, he had some more. Min hamatana ha'achat or shte matana arba matana shel dam b'karbonot. When you bring a karban, certain karbanot required 1 sprinkling or pouring of blood. Some required 2. Some required 4. You don't switch the number. The number that Hashem gives you, that's how many you give. That's what you do. You're not supposed to add more or subtract. Mitzvot elu kayotzi bohem. These mitzvot that give us a specific way of performing them, these are all the words of Hashem, Diber Hashem Eleinu, that Hashem spoke. If you add or you subtract. In other words, if you change the specifics of what Hashem has commanded us, mezayefet var Hashem, you're falsifying the word of Hashem. Machnitz svara enushit, you're interpreting, you're inserting a human thought process. Le'emet shel machshvot Hashem nitzrit, and you're undoing the truth of Hashem's eternal thoughts, because Hashem knows exactly why He commanded 4 parshat and tefillin and not 3 or 5 or 7 or 23. Hashem knows that, and we, by you substituting human rationale or logic or whatever, you are changing what Hashem said. Moridet hamitzvot Hashem yisad ledargat hashtichiyot shel chitzoniot enushit. You are lowering the level of these mitzvot to human. You're basically doing what you feel like doing, not what Hashem wants you to do. And that is true whether you add or you subtract. Very, very clearly, Rav Hirsch says it very clearly, that when we change in any way what Hashem has commanded us to do, we're no longer doing what Hashem has commanded us to do. We're doing what we want to do. Okay, that was Rav Hirsch in Vetchanan, Rav Hirsch here. Okay, Chalukot haparshiot shel hamisorim, the way the Torah is divided, our pasuk that we read in our parsha, Moresh pasuk zeh hasiyum shel amru lefanav, is the end of the chapter that came above it. Even though I put it above as a separate pasuk, it's really part of the chapter that came above. V'zu mashmoto, and this is what it comes to teach us. Mishum kach, because of this, al tamtzi lecha derachim chadashot shel avodat ha'el. Don't look for new ways to serve God. In other words, you'll say, what they did in the Beit HaMikdash wasn't such a great idea. Let's find some other way. Or what we do in Shul every Shabbat, that's not good. Let's try something else. Al tevarkesh litratzot lelokecha b'drachim shonot me'elu shenifku al yadav. Don't try to approach Hashem and develop a relationship with Hashem in ways that are different than those that were established by Him or through Him. Rak im taseh bene'emanut et mashu tziva. Only if we do honestly and truthfully and trustworthily what He has commanded, tabiyat hachniah shu mitzap elav mimcha. Then you will have established the relationship as Hashem wishes from you. You establish that you are Hashem's servant. Why? Because you do what He asks, not by making up things that He didn't ask for. Hu hitil alecha mitzvot. Hashem has placed these commandments upon us. And He has showed us the way to fulfill them. And these mitzvot are kiyumam, and the way of fulfilling them, mivatot et ritzono. When we fulfill the mitzvot in the way that we are commanded, we are doing what Hashem wants us to do. These mitzvot tell us what Hashem expects from us, what He wants us to do, in order to create a life that is lived in accordance with Hashem's will. Just like she'ein bohem peri machshavot libcha, just like we should not have any of our own personal thoughts and personal ideas in this. Elahein taftiv elokecha. These are what Hashem wrote and commanded us. Kein also l'chol etakenosam. We cannot adjust them. Losif alem oli gra mehem, to add or to subtract. Im kol tosevet o migrat tichtaleno liyot tichtav elokecha. With any change, they stop being God's words. Once we add or subtract, we're no longer fulfilling God's wish. We're fulfilling something that we decided we wanted to do. So if we want to fulfill what Hashem wants, we got to keep it as it is, not add or subtract. Rabbeinu Bechaya says the following. Yes, here Hashem is warning us. Person shouldn't say, I'm such a wise guy, I'm such a brilliant person. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to add something. Hashem gave me this mitzvah. I'm going to add something to it. And I'm going to, by doing that, and a person shouldn't think Oh, by adding something, I'm doing it even better. Look at that. He asks for only one thing. I'm giving him this all this more stuff. Lakach amar lo tosifa. That's why it says don't add. Ki Torah shlema. The Torah is complete. Eina tzricha tosefet. It does not require any additions. Umigrad, and it doesn't require anything to be removed from it. If you add, you're goreya, you're taking away because you're no longer doing what Hashem has commanded. Razal Dorshu, and again he brings on the Chazal, going on tefillin, adding a fourth parshat to tefillin. If 4 is good, 5's got to be better. What's wrong? All right, my tefillin is too small. I'll add a 5th parshat to it. Okay, v'chein birkat kohanim, and similarly birkat kohanim, or arabinim belulav. I'm sorry, arabinim shalulav. I'm going to add another. Again, if 4 is good, 5's got to be better. Let me add another bracha. 3 brachot are good, 4's got to be better. All of these things are taboo, are not to be done, and that's exactly what Rabbeinu Chaya tells us, and that's what we've seen before. But all of the enactments that the sages have done over the years in terms of putting fences around, this is not considered adding to the mitzvot of Hashem. Kilo ba'u, because the Chachamim did not come el lishmor et ha'ikar, to guard the basic, to make sure that we don't transgress the basic commandments. Just like anybody, a person who has a vineyard, he makes a geder, so you make a fence around it so that the plants should be protected. As we know that we have it says, go away, we tell a Nazir. When a Nazir who's not allowed to drink wine or have grapes comes close to a vineyard, we throw him away, we shoo him away. That's the same thing here. The Chachamim did the same thing to make sure that we don't come close to the Torah. They tried to keep us farther away from transgressing. Adarabba, ha'over al gidreim mitachanoteim, somebody who transgresses their takanot, their fences, over Allah, he's transgressing a negative commandment of the Torah that tells us that we are supposed to obey the Chachamim when they are acting appropriately within the framework of the Torah to establish protections around the Torah to make sure we don't transgress. And that's exactly what the Torah commands. That we should guard that which needs to be guarded. Chazal tell us, if you want to make sure that we carefully protect the Torah and the mitzvot, we have to put fences around to protect it. Kleyakar. Kleyakar says very simply, I understand not to add. I would think if I add a 5th min to the lulav, I still have the 4 there. What's the problem with adding a 5th one? Because if I have a larger amount, that shouldn't be a problem. Why? That's why the Torah has to tell us no. Why does the Torah need a pasuk of don't take away? Why? The Kleyakar asks a very simple question. I understand why the Torah tells us not to add, because even though I'm adding, I've still included the base. But to subtract, once I subtract, I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. If I only take three parshot, I don't have a tefillin. But if I have put 5 in, I have the 4 in there. So why is that? What's the problem with that? That's why we need a specific commandment of lo tosifo. We shouldn't need a mitzvah lo tigru. So therefore, he says, Mamar perashnu shelo tigru eno tzivut. This Kleyakar says this pasuk is misunderstood. When it says lo tosif al davar v'lo tigru imenu, it doesn't mean that these are 2 separate negative commandments. Don't add and don't subtract. Ella perusha. When it says don't subtract, it means don't add, because by adding you're subtracting. So it's really that we shouldn't do something so that we don't sin. We shouldn't be overly in awe of Hashem that we cause others to sin. There it says it's not we shouldn't command keep ashudhu. It's obvious that we shouldn't do this, so we shouldn't sin. In other words, what he's saying is lo tigru is really giving what happened here? Oops. Kach perush lo tosifu. We're not supposed to add because mimela lo tigru. Kol amosif gogeya. Kiman David ha nafil baha. Ukamo netinat tam al lo tosifu v'shamarachna. So the point is what Kleakar is saying, that there aren't two separate mitzvot of lo tosifu and lo tigru, but lo tigru is the result that will happen if you add. Once we add, we will end up we have already taken away from the mitzvah by changing it. And that's what he's saying. Okay, Shimon. Shimon says the following. Again, he quotes the pasuk. Now, Patach b'lashon rabim, Messiah b'lashon yachid. He starts with Asher Anochi mitzaveh etchem, which is a plural. Ototishmu laso lo tosef olav singular, lo tigran menu singular. So his question is, why do we start with the plural and end with the singular? And similarly, b'et chanan ksiv gam ken azarazu lo tosifu lo tigru. Aval hakol b'lashon rabim. Over in the second time we have this pasuk, it's all in the plural. So why sometimes is this in the plural, sometimes in the singular? Yesh lomar. His answer is the following. The yadua the kamosha asur lahosif al dalid minim shebelulav v'alabachutim b'titit oligroa. Just like we know, we've already talked about how we're not supposed to add another species to the lulav or another thread to the tzitzit or to take away. Kain over al baltosif. You are transgressing this commandment. If you add a mitzvah to the Torah by making up a new mitzvah, or you remove a mitzvah and say, that's no longer pertinent, that's no longer relevant. And even lomar al mitzvah d'Rabbanan, even to take a rabbinic command, and say it's a Torah command, over al baltos, if you have transgressed this law, if you take a command that is rabbinic in nature and say it's a Torah command, you have now added a new Torah command, which didn't exist. Ki de'ita b'Rambam perak halacha helchot mamrim perak bet, that Rambam brings us as halacha that even if you add something that is already a rabbinic law and say it's a Torah law, you have transgressed this commandment. Yesh lomer dehaya svara. The reason that in some places it's singular and in some places it's plural is because it's a logic that an ordinary person is not allowed to add and subtract. Why? Because by him making up his own mitzvah or taking the mitzvah away, he is removing himself from the congregation. Aval, so I might have thought him call Yisrael if it was only written in the singular, I would have thought, okay, we know that we don't want a singular person to add or subtract because then they're removing themselves from they'll be different than everybody else. But we might have thought if all of Am Yisrael agrees to add or subtract, that might be okay. Therefore, that's why we need it in plural also. But I also need it in singular also. If that's the case, I should have just written in plural and we'd know. But why? I need it both ways. The dafko, if I might have also thought the following, if I only wrote it in plural, the dafko call Yisrael Yosifo Yigru Ad Mevatani Kvar Torah Bichlala. If all of Am Yisrael decides to add a mitzvah or take away a mitzvah, then they've totally destroyed the Torah. Then we no longer have Taryag mitzvah. We now have Taryag mitzvah. We have 614 mitzvah if everybody agrees to add or take one away. So I might have thought that's a problem. One generation will add this one, another generation will take this one away, and by the time you turn around, all the mitzvah of the Torah will be gone and will be changed because every generation decided to throw two more in and take two out, take three in or whatever. So therefore, it has to be in plural. Avol yachid, I might have thought if it didn't have the singular, I might have thought that a single person, yachid ha'osel l'shem shamayim bi'atzmo, if a person is motivated for Hashem and he by himself wants to add a new mitzvah, mutar, I thought that might be mutar because the whole congregation is adding it, just he's adding it. Therefore, he's here at Torah et kol davar shenech mitzavchem oto tishmeru lo tosif olav afilu hayachid So since there's a logical reason to say, oh, it might be okay for the everybody to add, and there's a logical reason to say, well, it's okay if one person adds, therefore we need both of them. Now, before we finish, I just want to finish with one quick thought from one of the earliest stories that we have in the Torah and Bereshit that talks about adding and subtracting mitzvot. Very familiar story. We know that when they were in the garden, the snake comes to Chava and says, what? He says, oh, there's this beautiful tree. What does she say to him? She said, she says to the snake, God says we're not allowed to eat from it, and we're not allowed to touch it, because if we do, we'll die. And the Nachash, according to Midrash, pushes her in, she touches it, and she doesn't die. Says, see, you can eat it too. Now, what's the problem here? Rashi says, by adding, you shouldn't touch it. Hosifa ala tzivoy. She added to God's original commandment, which was what? Don't eat from it. Ulefikach bali de giraon. And through her adding, she came to subtract. Hushanemar, and that's why it says in Mishlei, al tosef al dvarav, you should not add anything to the words of Hashem, because by adding, you are going to cause yourself ultimately to subtract. And as Rashi says there, what happened? Dachma, he pushed her achenagabo till she touched this thing, and just like you're allowed to touch it, you're allowed to eat it, and you won't die. And Tifsei Chachamim adds, wait a minute. Yesh makshim. My raya who's there? The Nachash Shadacha Shinaga Ba'etz Lo Meta. Habe Emet Lo Who's Haro Elo Achila V'Lo Al Negia. Why is that a proof? The fact that she didn't die when she touched the tree, why should that be a proof to his words? The real command was only for eating it. For Isha Atzma, and the woman herself, Lama Lo Yaro L'Nafsha. If indeed she is the one who added don't touch it, then she should have remembered, wait a minute, I'm just the one who made up don't touch it. That was my protection for myself to make sure I didn't eat it, was to say I don't touch it. So the problem, says, wait a minute, the problem with Rashi's interpretation is if she added it herself, then she would have known she added it. And when he pushed her and she touched it, he would say, oh, wait a minute, God didn't really say we can't touch it. He only said we can't eat it, so I'm still not going to eat it. So obviously, there's something wrong with Rashi's comment, right? That's why the Kasha my data the shows Shiva Yeshlomar. That's what it was not. Hatzivoy Haya Eladam. When Hashem spoke about the tree, he only spoke to Adam. He didn't speak to Chava. Adam tziva l'Chava. He commanded Chava, don't eat it and don't touch it. He told her, don't touch it either. Why? Because he added this as a protection. What happened? He says, she'll forget, she'll touch it. She thought Hashem commanded Gil. Why? Because Adam made a fatal mistake here. Instead of telling her, God commanded don't eat it, and I think we shouldn't touch it to make sure we don't eat it, he said, no, God said don't eat it and don't touch it. So she misunderstood that his command, his, quote, rabbinic enactment of don't touch it was part of the Torah command. Again, that's why we see that it's very important that when we are going through and trying to understand, and when we're learning and going through halachot, we have to be very careful. What is the Torah command? What is the rabbinic command? Because if not, we will get ourselves in trouble. And we hope and pray that we will understand that, again, very basic rule. We're not supposed to add and subtract from the Torah's rules. The Chachamim are adding things that are not new mitzvot. They are things to protect us from transgressing existing mitzvot. And they didn't add, but they that the chagim that they've quote added unquote, I use that term very loosely, of Purim and Hanukkah were not added as chagim just like every other chag. They are in a different category of Pirsume Nisa, of publicizing the miracle. And that's why, again, on Purim we focus so much on reading the Megillah and publicizing the miracle. Same thing on Hanukkah, the lighting of the candles is to publicize the miracle. Yes, we call it a chag, but it's not the same concept as the chagim of Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur that are given in the Torah. It's a different level because it has a different purpose of Pirsume Nisa. So I hope that we should be zocheh to have more holidays of Pirsumei Nisa as Hashem continues to protect Am Yisrael, and that ultimately we will be able to not only have those holidays, but all of those fast days that we know will ultimately turn into Chagim also of a different nature when HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings the Gula Shleim Me'er Yameinu. Thank you all. I open it up now for questions, comments, and feedback. Anybody, any questions, comments, or feedback? Wrong button. This one. Any comments, questions? Okay. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you all for listening. Have a good rest of the week. Have a